Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to know how everybody's doing out there in the listenership and viewership of allpointstv.com. I'm George Moss, the host of the program called What's Going On. It comes on at 2 o'clock, and we stay around for about an hour. And I have the greatest news of all to tell you that after our program is over today, you'll be able to see another program that comes on around 3:30. It stays around for about 30 minutes. And that is the outstanding program called Satura's Black History Corner, which I run home after this program is taped. And I run home to watch it so I can watch it live. And they'll be coming to you at 3:30. That's Miss Catherine Hunter Williams and Miss Catherine Blake. And they do a fine job every 2 weeks. And they come in on the second and fourth Mondays of each month. I'm here every Monday, so you have to put up with me. You don't have to put up with me, but we're glad when you do. And we are here to bring some new insights, hopefully, to a couple of things that you're watching and paying attention to. I come here to the studio, by the way, pretty much elated over the fact that I won. I was telling you, I was telling you over the last 2 weeks about the bets I've been waging against this one friend of mine, a very close friend, and I've always been on the losing end. I think about 99% of the time, but I finally came through. Wait just a minute. John, I finally had a breakthrough, and I won this bet. I bet it on the Golden State Warriors, and I knew I had the greatest player on the other side over there with the Cleveland Cavaliers, but I just thought that this was not their year, and I saw this great player that I had never seen him before this year, because I don't pay attention to basketball until the playoffs, and by the time I tune in the playoffs, like the second round. And I think in the past, maybe last year when they played, I think they may have been eliminated before I began to tune it in. But I didn't know that, and I didn't even know. It shows you how far behind I was. I didn't even know that Stephen Curry, I guess the way he pronounced it, was playing in the NBA. So that lets you know about my basketball IQ. I mean, I can't even dribble a basketball, but during the playoff, I do tune it in. I want to see what the champion. So I don't want to know at the beginning of what goes on. I want to know how the movie ends. I can go to the end of the movie, show me the last 15 minutes, and I'm pretty happy about that, because the plot, thickens, and then at the end you have the climatic last scene where it all is brought to an end, and I can kind of pick up on the plot by looking at how the end result occurs. Now, I don't ask people to do this, but sometimes you might want to think about starting, when you read books, start at the end of the book and see how the book ends, and then go back there and see, okay, how did we get here? And start at that end. Why do you have to start all the books out at the beginning of the book? You can start some books out. A good book is the autobiography of Malcolm X. It would be good to start with the epilogue of the book. And, I think it starts around page 366, that, let's see, page, I think it's maybe page 416, I could be wrong. But in the back of the book, you can start with the epilogue, and then you could go back to what Alex Haley, who is really the writer of the book, Malcolm X is talking through him, and he's doing the writing of what's on the pages. Some of it, I think, they put on there without Malcolm's approval, and that can be documented. But you start at the back of the book and find out how when the plot thickens, it comes to a climactic conclusion. Then you go back and see, okay, how did we arrive at this end over here, and what's the beginning of the narrative? And you read it with the idea of how it's going to end, and you're carrying the ending into the meat, heart, and soul of the narrative, and it makes it exciting because you already know how it's going to end. Now, y'all may think you may think that that is something that is untoward. Why would you do something like that? Well, let me tell you something. One of the most successful detective stories that's ever been on television, that everybody was tuning in, and when they had it as a part of the 4-part series that came on, Rock Hudson was in one, they had another person in another one, and they had another drummer that was bringing up another part of the quartet, but Columbo was the central part of it, and if they had pulled him out, the other three would not have worked. And what Columbo did was show you how the movie ended. The murder was committed at the beginning of the film. And then you want to find out, okay, how they're going to catch this guy. And that was a very tremendous change in how the plot is carried out in the other movies. What made Columbo different was that it started at the end and then work you back through it, so you find out, okay, how did that end result, whether murder had occurred. There's always a murder, by the way, and at the murder, you saw the murder having occurred, and now they want to show you how then you go through the story to arrive at how it is going to end. But you already know what has happened at the very outset of the program, and it was a working formula. It worked well for how many years was that on? And then when it came back as a every once in a while series, that was very popular also. But what really made it attractive was that it did something different. It began to bring about a different way of looking at how you, in fact, unfold the plot in the narrative, and it made it very exciting. So you can do that. Well, I went out yesterday. My friend took me out for breakfast. And I will say he took me back to Birmingham, which is about, 60 some odd miles from here, and went to a different restaurant. I insisted on not going back and having more of those pancakes and an omelet, so I didn't want that. But went to another restaurant in the general area. And after that was over, I'm thinking I'm going to go out to breakfast and go back home. I didn't get in this morning till 5 o'clock. And the reason was that this friend and I went down to Birmingham and had breakfast. But when I got back, he wanted to show a film, and I'm always for I like documentaries, and anything got information in it, you have my attention. So I was watching the film, and then he called another friend over, and then we got into a conversation, and then there was another thing that we watched, which was watching this mystic named Thurman, and some of the things he had done in lectures he had put across. We were watching that on a couple of tapes. Well, I don't know if you can say tapes anymore because everything is, it's no longer on these VHS format tapes. So anyway, we watched it on the computer, and we had a discussion about that. And before I knew it, time was rolling, and I looked up, and it was 5 o'clock in the morning. I had been with this guy. Now, let me explain that. When I was over to this guy's house, you can explain these things in today's world, because things are changing, right? And we were over there in a discussion that lasted. I think I went over to his house about 1, and then we left there about 1:15. We came back about 5 in the afternoon. And then this other guy came over, and then the discussions went on, and I got to make sure I beat them down, and I had to make them submit, and then all that noise that we were making. I guess he's in a condominium, so I don't know if the person next, there's housing on both sides, but I think the walls in between them are pretty thick. And anyway, I guess I was making so much noise because when I started to get excited about what I'm trying to say, I get louder in terms of, I don't want anybody to interfere with what I'm talking about. When you talk, when I'm talking, you listen. When you talk, I listen. That's the way that goes. And don't be interfering with me trying to respond to what you said. And I won't interfere with anything that you say as long as you do not go over there on the brink and start going off on these tangential cliffs where I just can't take it. I mean, I'm just like this guy named James David. Man, I just can't take it. So I have to I raised my hands. I'm interrupting at that point. But it was very lively, and I didn't get in to I let those guys waste all that time. Yes, I wasted about 13 hours. And I got home. I got in this morning about 5 o'clock. I got a couple of hours of sleep. And then I had to get up because the dogs are barking, and they want to go outside. I got 2 dogs over there. They wanted to go outside, and they didn't want to wait. And when they go outside, then I got to give them a bone for rewarding for going outside and not going to the bathroom in the house. And they're sitting there now waiting for me to go and get the treats. I've already had a full day. And here I am at the studio right now. But I'm very glad to be here. And we do have a lot to talk about. I was at the Juneteenth celebration. And it was fitting that this celebration, which takes place, we've had it 25 years in this city, and we have had it going on, quite frankly. If you want to talk about the celebration itself, the day that it celebrates is June 19th, called Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865. And it is celebrated because those slaves in Galveston, Texas, were the last ones to find out that Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January the 1st, 1863. It does not mean, though, that all the slaves were freed on June the 19th, 1865, because the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to all the slaves, but applied to the slaves in rebellious states. If you go to a map and look at where Galveston is in terms of its relationship to the contiguous part of the state, as it touches those states around it, you'll see that Galveston is on an island away from the contiguity. I'm gonna make up a word here. It's not a word. I'm talking about the contiguous aspects of the state, but it doesn't actually touch Texas, although it is considered to be a part of Texas. But it's all kind of like on an island by itself. I think it's connected. If I'm not mistaken, I don't want to misstate the highway, but I think it's my memory is that is Highway 40. I think the travel lane that goes across there is 45. I could be mistaken about that, but Galveston is off the coast of Texas, and so you can see why any emancipatory language that was in place would have been hard to reach that particular place, because it is not really attached to the other aspects of Texas. It's off the shores, and so that island had not heard of the Emancipation Proclamation until June the 19th, 1865. And that's why it is celebrated as Juneteenth. And that's a pretty big monumental day in some corridors. I'm sure Galveston every year, celebrates it. But it has to be put in context, and the context is that even if after June 19th, 1865, there was still slavery in the United States, but not in those states that had been in rebellion against the Union, because the Emancipation Proclamation was designed to reach into those states, and as a military response to the war that had gone on by this time for 2 years, it was Lincoln's way of adding another anecdotal aspect to the war that would have weakened the South and hopefully would have brought the war to a more conclusive end at an earlier period of time. But let's be honest here that that war has been the most misunderstood war in American history. And I want to tie that into what's going on right now in Charleston, because Charleston's where the Civil War, and I don't even like to use the word Civil War because it's not a civil war. This is a tax rebellion. This is a tariff war. This is a continuation of the war that had been fought in 1776 as a tax war against the British. And the people that were there after the British had been run off of the shores and made to pack their bags and go home, those persons were still around at the time that the Constitution was written, and you'll see their impact in the Constitution in terms of there will be no direct taxes placed upon the American citizens in that Constitution, because those persons, by the way, who were the revolutionists, were still alive at the time that was drawn up in 1787, and when it was ratified the following year, that provision could not be in there, and you would have ratification. I'll get to that, some other aspects to it as well, but that's monumental to understand, because there was an anti-tax sentiment in this country. And that sentiment is going to be ongoing, and it's going to be extant in the population up until around 1913, when those voices, those anti-colonial, those anti-tax voices, those anti-colonial voices had been quieted. It wasn't until 1913 that you could have a chance of reasonably getting by with nervous energy behind the scenes, not knowing how it's going to play out, when they pushed in 1913 the 16th Amendment, because that's a direct tax. And in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, where you had the tax provision placed in the Constitution. It did not allow for a direct tax, and also it did not even allow for tax on exports in this country. That's how much of an anti-taxation sentiment there was in the United States. They didn't fight the colonial war over the notion of taxation without representation. They came here to get away from taxation, period. And the way you frame that is nonsense. Okay, that's a major point. And so you had to wait. They had to wait. Now, I do know that Lincoln did put in place a direct tax during the war, but during those special circumstances where we began to print money and do things of that sort, and to put a tax upon people, you can believe that they heard and got that out of here as soon as that war had run its course. Because if that had stayed on those books, that rebellion would not have stopped. Because they had left because of the tariff laws. If you read the Constitution carefully, in the commerce provisions of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, you'll see that you can't tax exports. And so the question the government has always had to raise is, how does it get its revenue with the limitation that it had upon the tax stream? And you see, that's another way in which the framers, in their unbelievably incredible wisdom, in their genius, there was another way they limited government. Limit the amount of money government has. In other words, it is what is stated in Charles Adams' book, Those Dirty Rotten Taxes, in the first chapter, where he says that would allow the country to become almost Marxian without Karl Marx being at the founding points of how the nation began to play out over time, was the fact of its tax structure. Without the taxation that began to come into vogue in 1913 with the 16th Amendment, you would never had this Marxian expansion of government power, because we would not have had the revenue and resources to do so. And what has allowed the government to spin out of control is this taxation policies. They were brought into existence by the passage of the 16th Amendment. Without that, you still have small government and limited government, not only because of the proclamations in Article 1, Section 8, in those 18 provisions, but which is the enumeration of powers, and not just because there are powers that are separated on the federal level and on the state level, with the senators going there to watch over the federal government by the provisions in Article 1. Article 1, Section 3, where the Senate is set up, which would have sent the senators there with the idea they're going to be the watchdogs of the states. They could watch over what the federal government does. But it also was a limitation on the federal government by the fact the federal government did not have access to the purse strings of the nation. And by not having access to the money, they were not able to grow no matter what they had in mind, once the founders had in fact taken their rightful places as the heads of the country that they themselves had created. And they were the ones who created the nation and installed themselves as they should have. They knew what they were trying to do more than anyone else did. So they are therefore the ones at the very foundation of points of the presidential office holders. There's Adams, number 2, for example. George Washington was president of the Constitutional Convention. Thomas Jefferson, who became the Secretary of State under George Washington, had written the Declaration of Independence. John Adams, who had been assigned that role, but had given it over to Thomas Jefferson because Jefferson was a better writer than John Adams, and so he became the second. He was the vice president, became the second president of the United States. There we're going back to after John Adams, we went to Thomas Jefferson as the third president, and then James Madison, who had been the father of the Constitution, we were revisiting him, making him the fourth president of the United States, and James Monroe, one of the signers of the Constitution. One of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He is the fifth president. We got John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son. We're going back to Massachusetts, a pivotal state. And he's the sixth president. And finally, there is Andrew Jackson that breaks the stream as one of the persons who had no role and no relative in a role, as one of the persons at the foundational points of this nation. So Jackson, the seventh president, who came in 1820, well, he was elected in 1828, but he took over the office in 1829 and stayed there until 1837. Andrew Jackson, the seventh president, broke a mold. And by the way, you know, Jackson, I was talking about I want to make this point and tie this into the Juneteenth event, which I was trying to tie it in when I spoke there 2 days ago. I was the keynote person there. Didn't give me any time to get in the water before I got up there, but that was fine. And I want to commend all the person that put that together. There was a lot of work that went into it. And it went on for the whole week, and it didn't end until yesterday at 9 in the evening. Started again at 11 o'clock Sunday morning. I wasn't there. I was trying to collect on my on my breakfast. But I want to commend the person that put it on. And Paul, you did a good job with that, and I must commend you for 25 years of staying the course. And although you said you're not going to do it next year because you've done it for a quarter of a century, I don't know who can pick up that pace and do that in the coming years, because I don't think they have I don't see anyone out there that has your energy and your dedication that can pull it off. So I don't know how this is going to look down the road, but I do want to commend you for a job well done and for staying at it so long. Anyone that's committed to anything for 25 years, you know, I take my hat off. And I commend you for just being a stand-up person. And anyone invites me into a forum and know that I'm not going to be contained in what I say, and that I'm not going to let anyone restrain what I'm going to talk about, and will invite me under those circumstances. Those persons are very courageous, because I do not stand in lockstep with a lot of what is going on in the community. And you'll find that out as we go through, as I get into the present thing taking place in Charleston, South Carolina. I do intend to talk about that for a few minutes. Anyway, the founders were these great persons. Jackson broke the mold. But Jackson had been involved in the second attempt to push the British off of the soil, because they were back in full swing. And in the War of 1812, James Madison, by the way, who was one of the ones that wrote 29 of the Federalist Papers. You know, Alexander Hamilton wrote 51 of those. John Jay wrote 5. There were 85 Federalist Papers. And James Madison was the fourth president of the United States, had come in 1809, and he was a master in terms of the writings in the Federalist Papers. He was not a great president. You know, he had a high-pitched voice and didn't have a lot of charisma. And he and Alexander Hamilton were not all that close. I think Hamilton expected, being one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, I think Alexander Hamilton expected more support from James Madison in his conflict going back and forth between Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Because there's a little dispute going on here about big government and small government, and Alexander Hamilton was, in all of his brilliance, was pretty much big government, and Jefferson was a little bit more upon government restraint, and so there was a little bit of tension here between the two. But Madison took Thomas Jefferson's side, and that surprised Alexander Hamilton. But he was a brilliant scholar, and he's rightfully called the father of the Constitution, because that took a piece of work there to bring all these varying interests together. And I give the founders a lot of credit in terms of taking all these varied interests and gluing this nation, the mortar they had to have to bring all these varied interests together. Charles Beard, you were picking up on that when you wrote this book called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. So when Beard wrote that book, he was right to see that there were a host of non-communitarian interests, economic interests at play. They had to be bridged together, and they were bridged together very brilliantly by those who understood that they had to give some and give in on some in order to bring this result about, because all of them would have been endangered and would have been outside the umbrella of protection if they had not done so. So out of their common interests, they had to develop a communitarian interest, which was not based upon the disparity of interests that were out there. They had to be glued together, and they were able to do that, and you have to give them credit for it. Does not mean they were great politicians once they got in office. And by the way, none of them, the only person up there on Mount Rushmore is Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson is up there not so much because of his presidency. Jefferson's up there because of his pivotal role that he played as one of the key figures in the foundation of this country. He has to be up there. But I don't think it's because of his presidency. Although I will give him credit for the one thing that you must do in order to be great. Because you can claim, I am the greatest, but you're not the greatest because you did a lot of other things. Muhammad Ali is the greatest person in sports. But he's the greatest person in sports not because he could do calculus. He couldn't even pass the selective service test. So when he says the king, the champ is here, I heard that last night. The champ is here. The champion of what? He wasn't a champion of Jeopardy. He's not going to answer too many questions on that program, and he was not going to go in there and bowl anybody over with his poetry. I mean, this was not Shakespeare. But in terms of that, okay, he was good in one thing, and that's pretty much where greatness is, quite frankly. Because if you can do one thing well, and you can do it better than anyone else did it, that makes you great. That's what makes Ben Carson great, because he was a master in the neurosurgeon area, and no one could do what he was able to do, described in his book called Gifted Hands, where he had this peripheral vision that allowed him to see multiple things going on at the same time, and that's how he was able to accomplish a lot of things other persons could not accomplish. But I don't think that necessarily means that he's going to be a great politician. And from what I've seen, there are some qualities that we do need from him right now in terms of his honesty and his integrity, but in terms of some of the faux pas he's making in the political arena, I don't know about that. But let's give him credit for where his greatness where his greatness lies. Madison was in the writing of 29 of the Federalist Papers, was brilliant in the writing of those papers, because somebody could explain why they should give up the restraints that were in the Articles of Confederation and vote more power into Washington, D.C. It wasn't in Washington at the beginning. It was in New York, and then it went to Philadelphia, and then it went to Washington. But the question is, why do you want to put this kind of power in the hands of the federal government after they had this ordeal and this audaciousness on the part of the Parliament in Britain? Why would they want to do that again? After coming out of it, why would you want to go back to that model? And so they have to explain why that would, in fact, be able to work in this case, with all the restraints were put in place. And they put the purse strings in there as a way of furthering the ends of limited government. You cannot have big government without having big money to finance it. And that's what they were doing there. And it's amazing how many safeguards they put in there. And these jokers, when you know it, these jokers have broken underneath all those restraints were put in place, and there were multiple restraints that were put in place. And it's amazing that they were able to break those shackles and come from underneath that, which tells us a lot about the impropriety of politicians to break from underneath that which restrains their power as they go toward being more totalitarian than what was expected and pretended by those that were trying to nail those boys down and make sure that this result did not come above the fray to go back and revisit that which they fought against and tried to make sure it did not happen on these shores. It was all shores then. They wanted to make sure we didn't have it on these shores. But we have it now. We definitely have it now. And we might as well wake up and smell the coffee and understand what we are at this moment in time in this republic. I'm not even 1/3 through what we have to talk about today, because I've got to go to Charleston, but I want to talk about how we got to Charleston and why Charleston is important, because there are some things that nobody has seen. Let me tell you something. I'm a preacher's kid, and I have to tell you that has never I didn't know of my father, but that was always in my household in terms of I would visit my father, and because the habits with my father's house, in my father's house, was different than the habits in my mother's house. My dad required prayer at the table, and my mom did not. We didn't oftentimes eat as much at the table in my mom's house. My mom was working full time, and we had to fix the. We had to do our own cooking. My mom worked, so we had to learn how to cook. And I was cooking when I was 12, 13 years old. I would fix a lot of the meals. My older brothers could do it also. We had to be more independent because they pick up a lot of the slack, and provide for how the house was managed in the absence of our mom, who went across town and worked to put dinner on the table. But we were responsible for cleaning the house and washing the dishes and doing things like that. So we are as kids. We're trying to get to the meal. But when I went to visit my father, when I would start grabbing the biscuits, my dad would be looking at me like I had lost my mind because there was a ritual to go through. And that ritual was, and it wasn't that my rushing to say the shortest Bible verse, because after a while that didn't work. I always want to say Jesus wept, because I always was conditioned. I got my brothers around here, and they might reach in that basket and grab all the biscuits before I open my eyes up. So I tried to get to cut to the chase and open my eyes up and see what the biscuits were. And so I would say Jesus wept. My dad would look at me as if to say, I can't believe this. So I had to learn the habits of my dad. My dad was always, my dad would pray at the table, and we would have 2 meals a day when I visit him in the summertime, and there would be breakfast. And I remember one time the radio was on, and I started humming with the music, because the music was playing one of the Motown songs that was in Detroit, and I started humming, and my dad looked at me like I had lost my mind, and I learned by that look, that's not it. So I learned that. And so I'm a preacher's kid in that sense. And I have to tell you something. When I see things that go on, I do see a providential role in it. And I saw that in South Carolina. And I'll tell you about that. But I do want you to know, before we get to that part of Charleston, South Carolina, I do want you to be aware also that Charleston is where the Civil War kicked off. Because the first state that stood up against the broad expression of totalitarian power was Charleston, South Carolina. And they stood up out of their own self-interest. And anyone that wants to go back to that map that you were looking at when you went to find out where Galveston, Texas is located, go back to that map and look at where Charleston Harbor is located. Because all goods are coming into this country. And don't forget, I said earlier now that you cannot tax exports, goods going out of the country, which are made in this country going out. You could not put a tax on it. Not even today can you tax it. But you can tax goods coming into the country, and that's the taxation put on those goods produced elsewhere that are coming into this country. And of course, if you tax goods coming into the country, goods that are manufactured in the country that do not have that tax on it, and you're taxing those goods that come in, those prices are driven up. And therefore, the prices of the goods in the country made by those in the Northeast that are producing goods, they can sell their goods at a rate underneath that, but at a price above what it would be if they didn't have that competition raised above the level they would charge if there was no tariff. You can see how that may be objectionable to the South, particularly if you are taxing the imports where they have to pay a higher price for those things, and then and then when they export the goods, their goods are being taxed over there in those European markets that are retaliating against the policies in the North. You can see how this plays out. And Charleston Harbor is out there. Charleston Harbor is out there as one of the import centers of this country. They have a vested economic interest in the tax policies of the United States, and that's why they were the first ones to object. All right. We're getting ready to set a picture here, because I want to tell you about Charleston, because you have not seen Charleston, because you've not seen the providential role in it. And I'm going to tell you about that role. There was, first of all, Ferguson. And because of knuckleheads like Al Sharpton, and a person whose ignorance seems to be boundless, and that's the President of the United States, whose ignorance is incredible to me. In Ferguson, and of course, you know, Ferguson went off once they pushed the envelope over a person that was a known thug, and a person who had gone into a store before he went out into the middle of the street. He and his friend Dorian Johnson were walking down the middle of the road, and any officer that would have come up behind them and seen them walking in the middle of the road, even if they did not know that they had just robbed the store, which was a felony, even if they did not know that, would have told them in whatever tone they used to get out of the street. And when they reiterated what that conversation was about later on, as Dorian Johnson was telling the viewers in the aftermath of Michael Brown's death what that conversation was like, when the officer told them to get out the street, Dorian Johnson gave a benign explanation of what occurred next, when he said that he told the officer in response to him telling them to get out the street, told him, well, we're walking down to our friend's house. It's only 2 blocks away, and we're on our way down there. Which I need to give you a little bit of explanation of what is being said here in translation. And the translation of that is that we're walking down the middle of the street and we're not going to do anything. That's the translation of that. As a classroom teacher, I had to translate what my students were saying to me when I told them to turn around in the classroom. And when I would tell them to turn around, and they would say, well, all I'm doing was telling Sally about X, Y, and Z, I would tell them that's not turning around, that's talking. And in that talking, there's passive resistance. And in that passive resistance, what you're saying is that you're not going to do it. And when they would say, all right, when I would tell them to turn around, they say, all right, I would tell them I don't care if it's all right. Because that's not it either. Let me make sure my teeth are in here right. Turning around is a physical, observable phenomenon. It's not speech. You can observe it. You shouldn't have to listen to it. And compliance is that if you turn this way and you're told to turn around, I don't ask students to turn around. I tell them to turn around. Because the future is in front of them, not in back of them. Your legs aren't made to walk backwards. You're supposed to go where your eyes are looking. And your eyes are not in the back of your head. So when they would say, okay, I would say, I don't care if it's okay. And they said, all right. And they went from okay to all right. I said, I don't care if it's all right. If they went back to okay, I said, get out. Because I didn't allow passive resistance. And that's what Dorian Johnson was doing. We just going down the street. We only got 2 blocks to go. And me and my friend, we're going over to our friend's house, and he lives 2 blocks away. And what they were really saying to the officers, we're not getting out on the street, we don't care what you say. And that's where the confrontation started, at that passive resistance stage. But it began to escalate. And it got to the point of being out of control, where Michael Brown tried to take that police officer's gun when he sat in that car, blocking him from getting out of the car, hit that officer. And as the officer tried to pull his gun to defend himself, because he couldn't get to his nightstick or whatever he had in the car, pulled his gun out, and a shot was fired, and Michael Brown was hit in his hand, and that's why he is in fact bleeding. That's also why we can trace the way in which he behaved once he got away from the officer. Both he and Dorian Johnson running, no shots were fired at that point, but the blood splatters show he turned around and came back toward that officer. And once that had occurred, in the aftermath of all of it, the people stirring it up, George Soros is in there spending $33 million, which we now have been told through certain sources, alleged that he spent upwards of $33 million because people were being paid to be out there stirring the pot. And then people went out there not knowing they were being manipulated by Vance Packard, what Vance Packard called in his book, The Hidden Persuaders, a book that Packard put out back in the 60s. And the hidden persuaders are back there doing what they always do, and that's doing the puppeteering and orchestrating and pushing people up against each other, which is what most of this noise is about, and people not knowing about those in the background who are the puppeteers at the top pushing people up against each other. Then the intended results occurred, and people went out there and burned their community down with this flamethrower who just happens to be in these rooms with this president in Washington. When they meet, he's in their meeting as well, and we know this man's history because we know about Tawana Brawley in 1987, and we know about this person's role in the Tawana Brawley fraud. We also know about the fraudulent mechanics that were involved in the claims made against the Duke lacrosse players in North Carolina, and that was fraudulent. We know that the claim that Michael Brown had his hands up, and there's Sharpton demonstrating his hands up, don't shoot in a church in front of a crowd that's easily swayed toward hysterical and emotional nonsense, and we know that narrative was incorrect. And we know it based upon two different probes into the matter. We know it based upon the grand jury probe in Ferguson, and we also know it because it was a probe made because Eric Holder did not want to believe it. So he did a probe of his own and found came to the same conclusion.
Looking back at that too, Eric Holder's attitude towards this is basically he thought he knew everything about it, even though he wasn't there. I mean, I guess if you're an attorney general, I guess by his estimation, you become omniscient. And it's the same way with Obama. I mean, he reacted like that with that situation. Mm-hmm. You dealt with the Professor Gates situation like that. Mm-hmm. He was there. He knows everything. Yeah. I mean, it's just this sheer arrogance. I mean, what is wrong with somebody saying, I have to trust the people there, even if there's a cover-up, there might be a cover-up, I have to trust the people there. And if it doesn't, if it's not good, it's not kosher, it's going to come out in the wash. It seems like this president thinks he can second guess everybody. He is under his subordinates can second guess everybody. Mm-hmm. I never met a group of people who are so willing to jump into every situation totally unprepared and not knowledgeable about the situation. I never met a group like that.
Mm-hmm. This is something that the people of this country have not seen in their lifetime. This is the most racialist administration that we've had since the administration of the 20th President of the United States, which is Woodrow Wilson, who came into the presidency in 1909 and was there from 1909 to 1921. And it was in that administration that we have something comparable to what we're seeing right now. But some aspects of this administration we've never seen. We've not seen an administration this devious in its use of race, certainly not in the past 100 years, and the only model that even remotely comes close to it is Woodrow Wilson's administration. But this administration has been a disaster, and we're not there away from it yet. And I hope I get around to all of what I intended to say when I came here. I don't know if I'll be able to get it all in, but I'm going to make a Herculean try to do so, because there's some things I need to say in order to bring some of the things that are happening right now into a holistic discussion that has many different corridors in it, and different parts of the puzzle need to be put together, but there is a thematic whole once you understand how the whole picture looks. And I'm going to try to do that using South Carolina as an example of that. But just right at this point, keep in mind that South Carolina was the first of the states that stood up against what really was federal tyranny. That is to say that they had began to see as early as the 1820s, certainly with the tariff of 1828 and other tariffs that followed therein, that there was something going on. There was a fly in the ointment that was not intended to be there by those that had put this marvelous experiment together at the convention in 1787. I mean, they did not go there to do that, but they understood that they could not revise what was a document that really should have been DOA, dead on arrival, after they got to the convention, because it became very clear after they sat there for a while trying to amend this document, which was made up of 13 articles, by the way, that they just could not do anything with it. It just had too many flaws in it, And they were intuitive enough to understand they had to throw the baby out with the bathwater and start over anew. And that's something we can learn from as well, maybe in these times. I don't mean to throw everything out, but we've got to revisit some of it and find out how to re-nail some of the boards down, because those boards now come up from the seams. But they did some things at that convention that were very great, and it has to be acknowledged as such. And they tried to not only limit power by the separation of powers and the disaggregation of power from the federal level to the state level. Not only in the enumeration of powers in Article 1, Section 8, you can do these things here, and beyond that, not so much, because there are what is called implied powers. I don't know how you can understand what is not explicitly stated, and you understand the implications of all that which is that is stated, unless you go to what else is written. You see, the only way you can actually understand what is implicit in what's stated is go to some of the other writings. You see, it cannot stand on the non-written level. The way you find out what they meant by what they wrote is go look at other writings and see what they said there to find out what the implications are. You cannot glean implications from the writings if it's not stated. That's your interpretation of the implications. You have to go to see what else was stated, and you go into the Federalist Papers to see, well, okay, what were the thoughts that went into that? Because the background, of it is here's the background to it. Here's what they were discussing as they were discussing that which they had drawn up in the Constitutional Convention. This is what they meant by it. This is what they were saying about it. This is how they were explaining it. That's how you do that piece. But those powers that were not enumerated, they said that anything that's not enumerated and not forbidden in the Constitution to the states resides in those states and to the people therein. That was a way of controlling it as well. And then separating the three branches of the government so each one has a third of the power, not able to encroach on the other powers, the powers of the other two. That was restraint that was put in place. And there were a lot of other things that you could talk about that were there, but do not leave out the finance as a culminating part of it, because you don't have the purse strings, you don't have the money to pull this thing off. You don't have the money to grow government to the extent that it's been grown in this country. And Stefan Melanor, a philosopher in Canada, has exactly right. That it's phenomenal that a country can be born under the restraints of limited government, can now have grown to be the largest government on the planet, and the one that is holding the most debt. How did we get here? How did that happen? Well, the people in Philadelphia did not intend for any of that to happen, and the persons in Charleston, South Carolina stood up because it did happen, because they began to see that they were sliding from underneath that which was intended, and they stood up against it. This is no war against slavery. This is a war against the federal tyranny that began to encroach from underneath the Constitution at that point in time. And South Carolina, which was hurt by that tyranny because of the economic interest that it had in terms of having the harbor that was a central harbor in the country. Those exports that were going out through Charleston Harbor, and the imports coming in were coming in through Charleston Harbor. The economic interest is at stake here. And they stood up to protect their own state interests. And they decided, after having a civil war that had lasted in this country for 84 years, that's what a civil war was. And all you historians out there, all of you have missed that. You know why? Because you're a bunch of dunderheads. I'm sick of you parents. All you know how to do is repeat. And every one of y'all, I hear y'all here discussing Abraham Lincoln. Not one of you nuts have it right. You can't put this man up there above George Washington. And you can't put Franklin Delano Roosevelt above George Washington. George Washington is the greatest president this country has had. And the reason that he's great is because the man had enough statesmanship. Roosevelt didn't have this. This man didn't have one law on the book that required him to step down from power. Not one law. And he could have been king. And this man stepped down from power after 2 terms, left his office, and had enough sense to surround himself with people who were smarter than he was. And one of them was Alexander Hamilton. And guess who was his Secretary of State? Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury. Nobody else in this country could have filled that role. Hamilton was the one that did it. And he wasn't perfect, but there was not one person in the country, but let's expand that, because there was not one person in the world that could have put together what Alexander Hamilton put together in this country from scratch. I'll come back to that point, because something is going on right now that you need to know about, and I'm going to tell you about that if I have enough time. But George Washington surrounded himself with people who were brilliant, and around him were these outstanding thinkers. He wasn't just Hamilton. Hamilton was great. And I didn't agree with a lot of things that Hamilton did. Don't get me wrong on that point. But I have to give justice where justice is due. And that's due Alexander Hamilton. And Secretary of State was this brilliant writer, thinker, founder of the University of Virginia. That's Thomas Jefferson, who became the 3rd president. And he wasn't nearly as good a president as he was a great theorist. But he wasn't a bad president either. And he did believe in limited government, so that was good. And I give him credit for the one thing that he did extremely well. He went in there and reversed all that nonsense that come out of John Adams' hand in terms of signing into law the Sedition Act, Alien Sedition Act of 1798, which I can't believe that he put that in the books, having his revolutionary background, and then he puts signs into law a bill that spoke to the very tyranny that he had stood up against as one of the signatories in the Declaration of Independence. Oh yeah, we forget when we get power. But when Jefferson came in there succeeding after they ran a political coup pretty much on John Adams, Jefferson came in there and reversed that. I think that's great. And I would say, based on that alone, he belongs on Mount Rushmore. But you can take those other 2 jokers down. And one of them up there is Alexander Hamilton, not Alexander Hamilton. The other one is Abraham Lincoln. I'm not buying that. You can't push that by me. I don't care how many of you scholars out there. You don't know any more about Lincoln than I know. And I intend to shut you down and shut you up, because your nonsense cannot be allowed to stand. There's no president standing above George Washington. And so we're now in South Carolina, right? And I also was in New Orleans. I did not tie that together, but when I was talking about New Orleans, I was in there talking about the fact that when that war came to a close in 1812, you know, the war in which Francis Scott Key wrote in 1814 while being on that ship, watching what was going on at Fort McHenry, and seeing that fort on fire, seeing those flags are burning. Well, you saw them writing the Star Spangled Banner that was set to music and became the national anthem in 1931 under Herbert Hoover. That's when it became the national anthem. And the prophetic aspect of it is that in the prophetic aspect, South Carolina plays a role of coming in at the right moment after Jackson had pushed the British off again, came in at a time when the nation needed him again to fill a military role, because South Carolina was threatening again the states were, South Carolina was making a threat to go it alone. And what they did was install Jackson in there, who had this role over there in 1814. Jackson is still fighting, as a matter of fact. After the war had come to an end, he's still there fighting, because they have not heard in New Orleans that the war has come to a close, just like they had not heard in Galveston that the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, because news doesn't travel at the speed of the internet like it does right now. So they're still fighting in New Orleans, and they're not forgotten that, and that's why they put Jackson in there, who broke the mold. He's not one of the founders. He's not one of the signatories. He was not there, but he's in the presidency right now, and that's why they installed him. Because there's a fly in the ointment, and we're now beginning to find out that the work that needs to be done is not being done, because there's a civil war going on in the country. Because those senators up there in Washington, D.C. are fighting, and they're fighting on behalf of those states, because that's who they represented. And that's what's going on in the country, in the Congress at this point. And every one of the historians in this country has missed that. Every one of you. Because you're a bunch of knuckleheads. A bunch of parrots. All of y'all sound the same way. There's a civil war going on in the country, but the war is not a shooting war. That's what you miss. It's not a shooting war. There's a civil war going on. There's civil discourse. There's civil discord. And they're going back and forth. You know why? Because the generation that was installed to do its work did not do its work. Every generation is called upon to do its work. And that's what I was trying to say in Juneteenth. When I was out there, they had a group of young people went up there called Raise It Up. And I was trying to say to them that you got to understand Paul Robeson's conversation with Harry Belafonte, because Harry Belafonte asked Paul Robeson, what did you learn from your experience? You have lost everything. And if you had to do it all over again, knowing then what you know now, would you do it again? And Paul Robeson asked him and said to him that I would do it all over again because I'm committed to principle. But one thing I did not know when I started out, and that was I did not know when I started out that every generation has to rise up and do its own work and save itself. So they were given a task to do. And 85 years, really, if you want to be I'm talking about 85 years, but if you want to be clear about it, and we're going to start in 1787 rather than 1786, and you want to start in 1787, then okay, 84 years, to get the rest of the work done, and they did not do it. And because it was not resolved, then they began to vacate the premises, and they began to leave the Union, which was a war of secession. This is not a civil war. A civil war is something different, where they're fighting over the power within the same territorial boundaries, and that's not what they're doing. They're trying to vacate the territorial boundaries, and they're leaving. Elvis has left the building. So April the 12th, 1861 is the firing of Fort Sumter, and they're firing at Fort Sumter because, and I was in Fort Sumter I had been given a $15,000 grant by the university, along with two other persons in my department. We were given $15,000 to do some scholarly work on the Sea Islands of South Carolina. I went into Fort Sumter to see what that was like and to understand that experience. And I understand it very well, having been inside that fort. Because they were sending those cannons into that fort that were on fire. And every time one of those cannons hit into that fort, it set that fort on fire. You can believe the generals were in the back. They sent the corporals up there to the front. Their job was to put those fires out. And that fort's out there in an island. Well, South Carolina was pivotal in terms of the starting of that war of secession, as they're trying to extricate themselves from the Union because of the objection to the taxation policy of the United States. So they're trying to succeed from the Union, not to, in fact, fight for control of the Union. So it's not a civil war in any sense of the word. But South Carolina was the one that hit it. Okay, well, I got to get out of here. But the final thing that I wanted to say was that in South Carolina, we had a situation Wednesday last week, where there was this person that went into a church. This situation that started in South Carolina, it started in Ferguson. And you may want to say it didn't start even in Ferguson, but let's start with Ferguson as a starting point. And then Ferguson, envelopes were pushed and people burned their community down. And then it went into Baltimore, and people were pushing envelopes from behind the scenes, and people burned their city down. But just like they did with Rosa Parks in 1955, after having arrested Claudette Colvin, they went and messed with the wrong one. Because when they arrested Claudette Colvin, she wasn't the right one, and they could not rally behind her because of some of the baggage she had. But with Rosa Parks, they messed with the wrong one. And then in this case right here, they had pushed the envelope in Baltimore. They pushed the envelope before that in Ferguson, got the results that they wanted, but they went to South Carolina. And when they went to South Carolina, they messed with the wrong one. They went to a church, by the way, which is the place where they were on holy ground. There was ground that was carved out by the slave named Denmark Vesey in 1822. That church, called the Emmanuel AME Church, was on the foundational grounds that was built by that slave population. They knew their heritage, they knew their history. And when they went in there to push that envelope, 11 people were at that table. And I said at Juneteenth, Providence was there. Because the providence was that there were 11 people at the table that Jesus was at when Judas had left. But at that table there, Judas was still sitting there. And in sitting there, he wanted to push the envelope to start a war, a civil war. You got it? But he messed with the wrong one, because this had been taken to church. And God was there. All right. Got to get out of here. Until next time, I want you to follow your dream. Because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.